It was a cold and quiet morning in the small prairie town of Elmsfield, the kind of morning that blanketed the world in silence. Save for the occasional creak of a wooden sign swinging in the wind or the soft crunch of boots on frost-covered ground. The town had not yet come fully alive. Chimneys began to exhale thin trails of smoke into the pale sky, and the sweet scent of rising dough and burning firewood drifted down the single cobbled main road. The windows of Margaret Bennett's bakery glowed warmly from the inside, casting golden rectangles of light onto the dew-speckled street. Inside, Margaret was humming an old tune passed down by her grandmother as she kneaded a fresh batch of bread, her hands moving with practiced rhythm. Each fold and press a comforting ritual that began every day. Margaret was not a woman who sought attention. She was nearing 60, with silver-streaked hair usually tied in a loose bun, soft eyes that had seen both hardship and joy, and a gentle smile that made strangers feel like old friends. Her bakery, Bennett's Hearth, was a simple building, with ivy creeping up its stone exterior and shelves lined with homemade jams, hand-sewn tea towels, and loaves of bread that tasted like home. Locals swore by her honey oat loaf, and children often pressed their noses to the glass to catch sight of the gingerbread cookies she occasionally shaped into animals or stars. That morning, as she was placing the first batch of freshly baked bread into the window display, she noticed something unusual, something that made her pause. Bread in hand. Across the street, just beyond the edge of the bakery's glowing window light, stood a boy. At first, she thought he might be one of the neighborhood children, perhaps waiting for his mother or lingering after delivering milk. But as her eyes adjusted to the gray morning light, she saw him more clearly and realized he was unlike any of the children she'd come to know. He was small and painfully thin, no older than 7 or 8. His dark brown hair was matted and tangled, and his face, streaked with dirt, bore an expression that was far older than his years. His clothes, if they could be called that, were mismatched and ragged, barely clinging to his frame. He wore no coat, only a torn wool sweater with sleeves too long and holes at the elbows. His shoes were nearly falling apart, soles flapping with each shift of his feet. But what struck Margaret most were his eyes. They were not the lively, mischievous eyes of a boy playing hooky from school. They were wide, sunken, and hollow, fixed intently on the loaf of bread she had just placed in the window. He looked at it not with longing, but with something deeper, desperation, maybe, or disbelief, as though he couldn't decide whether what he saw was real. Margaret felt her breath catch. She set down the tray of bread and walked out from behind the counter without saying a word. The bell above the bakery door jingled softly as she stepped into the chilly morning air. She didn't bother to grab her coat. She didn't ask the boy who he was or where he had come from. She didn't need to. Something in her heart, the same part of her that always left a few loaves outside the door after closing time for whoever might need them, spoke louder than any questions. The boy flinched slightly as she approached, but didn't run. Margaret slowed her steps, moving with the same careful gentleness she used when tending to a wounded bird or a crying child. When she reached him, she knelt down to his level, ignoring the cold that bit at her knees, and extended a warm, fragrant slice of bread wrapped in a napkin. "Here, sweetheart," she said softly. "It's still warm." The boy hesitated for only a second before reaching out with both hands and taking the bread. He looked up at her, his lips trembling as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then, in a voice so faint she almost missed it, he whispered, "Thank you." His eyes shimmered not with tears, but something older than sadness. Maybe it was relief. Maybe hope. Before she could ask his name or invite him inside, the boy turned and ran, clutching the bread tightly to his chest. He disappeared around the corner and into the trees beyond the edge of town, leaving Margaret standing there, heart aching and hands still warm from the loaf she had given away. Margaret remained outside for a few moments longer, staring down the path the boy had taken until the mist swallowed him whole. The early morning chill finally crept into her bones, and she rubbed her arms absent-mindedly, not because of the cold but because something in her chest felt unsettled. She had always considered herself a practical woman, not easily shaken. But there was something about that child's face, the silence in his movements, the way he held the bread, like it was life itself, that stayed with her like a splinter beneath the skin. She turned back toward her bakery and stepped inside. The soft chime of the bell above the door feeling oddly distant this time. The warmth of the hearth welcomed her, and the scent of cinnamon and fresh yeast rose to meet her like an old friend. She stood for a moment behind the counter, her fingers still tingling from the boy's cold hands. Then, with a sigh, she went back to her work. There were still loaves to be shaped, cinnamon buns to be glazed, and shelves to be restocked before the first customers wandered in. As her hands returned to the dough, her mind wandered. Margaret had lived in Elmsfield her whole life. She knew its rhythms, its people, its unspoken rules. It was a small town nestled among rolling hills and whispering woods, where everyone knew everyone, and change came slowly, like snow melting off a rooftop in spring. In all her years, she had never seen a child like that one who didn't seem To belong anywhere, he wasn't one of the town's schoolchildren. He hadn't come in with a family, and there was a stillness to him, a haunted quiet that didn't match the roughhousing and laughter she usually saw in boys that age. She thought back to the look in his eyes, not simply hunger, but deep exhaustion, as though he had walked far too far for a boy that small. Where had he come from, and why hadn't anyone noticed him before? It was possible he was passing through, of course. Elmsfield was surrounded by open country and forest trails. Sometimes travelers came and went, though not often, and rarely without stopping to rest at the inn or buy supplies from the general store. But this child didn't look like someone just passing through. He looked like someone who had been living without a place for a very long time. Still, Margaret reminded herself gently, there was only so much she could do in the moment. She hadn't chased after him because she didn't want to frighten him away. Trust was delicate, especially for someone who had learned not to expect kindness. Better, she thought, to leave the door open and the oven warm for the next time he came back. And in her heart, she believed he would. The rest of the morning passed with a quiet buzz of routine. A few early risers came in for their cup of spiced tea, a buttered roll, a loaf to take home for supper. They chatted about the weather, the coming harvest fair, and the mayor's odd new hat. But none of them spoke of a strange boy or mentioned seeing anyone unfamiliar that morning. Margaret thought about asking around just casually, but something held her back. She didn't want to risk exposing the child if he was hiding for a reason. Instead, she tucked the moment away like a keepsake in her apron pocket, checking the window more than usual between customers. By noon, the boy had not returned. Still, she set aside a small plate near the back door before closing for her midday break. A thick slice of honey oat bread, a piece of cheese, and a boiled egg. She didn't write a note, didn't announce it to anyone. She simply left it there, as she had done from time to time for others who had no home, no voice, no place. She went about her afternoon, as usual, stacking loaves, sweeping floors, refilling the jam rack, but her heart was quieter, softer. She kept hearing that whisper in her mind, the way the boy had said, "Thank you," like it had cost him something to say it, like it was the first time someone had seen him in a long while. That night, long after she had locked the front door and turned down the lamps, Margaret peeked out the window into the street. It was empty, save for the flicker of lanterns and the hush of night, but something in her soul told her that the story wasn't finished, that kindness like this didn't go unnoticed. And though she had no idea what was coming, she sensed it. Something had shifted. She just didn't know how much. The following morning began like any other, or so it seemed at first. The sun crept over the horizon in a slow yawn, casting long golden fingers across the fields and rooftops of Elmsfield. Birds fluttered sleepily in the trees, and the familiar clatter of wagon wheels began echoing down the town's narrow streets. Margaret had risen before dawn, as always, to begin her baking. Her hands worked through the motions, automatically mixing, kneading, shaping, while her thoughts lingered on the strange little boy from the day before. She had kept an eye on the back door all evening, but the food she left had remained untouched. Now, with the second batch of dough rising, she glanced out the front window, wondering if she might see him again. But what she saw instead made her breath catch. A faint sound like distant thunder rolled over the hills, not the roar of a storm, but the steady rhythm of hooves against hard ground. Margaret stepped closer to the window, shielding her eyes from the glare of the rising sun. At first, she thought it might be a traveling horse fair or perhaps a group of farmers heading to the next town over. But the sound grew louder, closer, and more purposeful. It wasn't a few horses. It was dozens, no, hundreds approaching, all at once. Outside, shopkeepers began stepping into the street, wiping their hands on aprons, shading their eyes, trying to make sense of what was coming. Children paused in their play. A dog barked once, then went quiet. Even the breeze seemed to hush as the townsfolk waited, and then, out of the morning mist, they appeared. Women, hundreds of them on horseback. They came riding in formation from the Western Trail, a winding path that led through thick woods and past abandoned homesteads no one had ventured near in years. The horses moved with calm purpose, not wild or charging, but deliberate and unified, their hooves beating a solemn rhythm into the earth. The women sat tall and silent in their saddles, wearing simple shawls and well-worn riding skirts. Some carried small bundles. Others had children clinging to their waists, and every single one of them wore an expression not of anger or fear, but of quiet, burning purpose. Margaret stepped outside, blinking in disbelief as they rode closer, their numbers too vast to count at a glance. Townspeople gathered on porches and sidewalks, mouths agape. Some women gasped. Men took off their hats in respect or confusion. Never in living memory had anything like this happened in Elmsfield. The entire square fell into stunned silence. As the first group of riders reached the edge of the town, one woman pulled ahead. She was older, with long silver hair braided down her back and eyes that held the weight of too many winters. She wore a faded blue shawl and dismounted with a grace that spoke of strength more than elegance. She walked slowly toward Margaret, her boots tapping softly on the stones, her gaze steady and kind. "You are the baker," the woman said. Her voice was low but clear, as though she were used to speaking so others would listen. Margaret swallowed. Yes, I am, the woman nodded. Yesterday, you gave bread to a child, a boy. He came to us last night with that bread in his hands and tears on his face. He told us what you did. Her voice trembled, just slightly. You saw him, you fed him. You didn't ask who he was, where he was from. You just gave. Margaret's throat tightened. I only did what anyone should have, but the woman shook her head gently. No, you did what few would, and for that, we came to thank you. Behind her, the other riders began dismounting. Some carried baskets, others carried blankets, crafted gifts, or jars of preserves, and one by one, they began stepping forward toward Margaret, toward the town, toward a place they had long kept distant from Elmsfield, still quiet in its morning haze, had become the center of something no one yet understood, and Margaret, standing barefoot, in her apron with flowers still on her hands, found herself at the heart of a story that was only just beginning. As the women dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate, the square began to fill with the soft murmurs of awe and confusion. It was as though time itself had paused to watch. Shopkeepers stood frozen in their doorways, some with flour dust hands, others with ledgers half filled. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, peeking out from behind them with wide, questioning eyes. Even the wind seemed to carry a hush, as if it, too, was listening. Margaret stood at the center of it, all utterly bewildered, deeply humbled, and quietly overwhelmed. She had never seen anything like it. The square that normally saw a handful of wagons and the occasional traveling peddler was now overflowing with women of every age and appearance, each face telling its own silent story. There were young mothers with babies slung across their backs, teenagers with fire in their eyes, elderly women with bent backs and weathered hands. Some looked like they had ridden through the night, others had dust on their faces and twigs in their braids. Yet they all wore the same looks, something between reverence and gratitude as they surrounded her, not in chaos, but in unity. The silver-haired woman who had first spoken to Margaret remained by her side, acting almost like a guide or emissary. My name is Nora, she said simply. We live beyond the forest, beyond the place where the old tracks disappear. You wouldn't find us on a map. Margaret nodded slowly, her brow furrowed. She'd heard rumors over the years tales of people living off the land, deep in the woods, cut off from modern society. Some called them hermits, others simply the forgotten, but never in her life had she actually seen any sign of them. No one had. Until now. What brought you all here? Margaret asked softly, her voice nearly drowned out by the murmurs of the growing crowd. Nora looked around at the gathering, her lips pressed into a thin, emotional line before she replied. The boy you helped yesterday, his name is Elijah. He is one of ours. He had wandered too far, as he sometimes does, and we feared he wouldn't return. When he came back with food in his hands and tears in his eyes, he told us someone in town had shown him kindness, that someone had seen him, truly seen him, and treated him like a child, not a shadow. Margaret's hands, still dusted in flour, trembled slightly. I only gave him a slice of bread. Nora shook her head slowly. No, you gave him dignity. You gave him hope. For people like us who have lived on the margins for so long, even the smallest act of kindness is a flame in the dark. By now, the townspeople of Elmsfield were beginning to gather closer, drawn by curiosity and something deeper, a sense that they were witnessing the unraveling of a mystery long kept hidden. Among them was the town mayor, Mr. Adler, a stocky man in his 50s with suspenders stretched over his gut and a skeptical expression permanently etched into his features. He stepped forward, clearly uneasy. Now, hold on, he said gruffly, trying to project authority. Who are you all? What do you want here? The women didn't flinch. Nora turned to him calmly and said, We come in peace. We came only to thank this woman and to let you all know we're here. We always have been. Margaret stepped forward before the mayor could respond. They mean no harm, Adler. These women. They're neighbors we never knew we had. There was a moment of stillness, the kind that settles when two worlds, long apart, suddenly touch. Then, something remarkable happened. A young girl, perhaps no older than 10, stepped forward from among the riders. She held in her hands a small hand-woven basket filled with herbs and wildflowers. With careful steps, she approached Margaret and extended it to her with a shy smile. For you, the girl whispered, but Margaret took the basket gently, her eyes moistening as she looked out over the crowd. Dozens of others began doing the same, offering small tokens, crafted gifts, pieces of themselves. It was not payment. It was something far deeper, the language of gratitude, spoken not with gold, but with the heart. And just like that, the townsfolk's hesitation began to melt. One by one, the people of Elmsfield stepped forward, not with questions or judgment, but with bread, tea, blankets, and open hands. Two women from the general store brought out folding chairs. The smith's wife offered fresh water. A mother set down a crate of apples. In that moment, the town square transformed not into a battlefield of suspicion, but into a gathering place of healing. And standing at its heart, Margaret realized something quietly profound. Sometimes, it takes just one small act of kindness to open a door that has been shut for years. As the warmth of connection spread throughout the square like morning sunlight, Nora turned once more to Margaret. Her expression was calm but grave, as though she carried stories too heavy for most to understand. Gently, she gestured toward a small group of women standing nearby, many of them holding the hands of children or balancing bundles of belongings on their hips. These were not women who lived in ease. Their faces bore lines etched from long years of labor, worry, and weather. Yet there was a quiet resilience in their eyes that needed no words. "You don't know what you did yesterday," Nora said softly, her gaze fixed on Margaret with a depth that made her breath catch. "But it meant more than you can imagine." Margaret lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. She had spent her life serving others in small, quiet ways, never seeking attention, never expecting reward. She was no heroine. She simply believed that no one should go hungry, especially a child. And yet, standing in that moment, among hundreds of women who had left the shelter of their hidden lives to ride into town just to speak with her, she began to understand that perhaps the smallest gestures can carry the greatest meaning, especially when they break through walls long built. Nora took a deep breath before continuing. "We are mothers, widows, daughters, sisters. Most of us lost someone, husbands to the mines, brothers to war, families to poverty and disease. Years ago, we began leaving. Quietly, without protest, without notice. Some of us were turned away, others simply faded from view. And over time, we created something new, a life outside of the town, away from judgment and control. We built homes deep in the forest, gathered what we could from the land, and made a place where we could raise our children in peace." Margaret listened, heart tightening with every word. She had heard whispers of people living beyond the trails, but like most in Elmsfield, she had never given them much thought. It was easier, she supposed, not to ask questions about those who disappeared. Easier to believe they had simply moved on, rather than been pushed away. Elijah, Nora said, glancing toward a cluster of younger boys in worn sweaters, was born into that life. He has never known the world you live in. He's never been to a schoolhouse or a market, but he's curious, brave, sometimes too brave. She smiled faintly, the edge of her voice softening. "Yesterday, he went farther than we allow. He wandered through the woods until he found your town. We didn't know he had left until it was nearly dark." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "He looked so tired, so hungry." "He was," Nora said. "But he was also carrying something we had never seen in him before. Hope, not just from the bread you gave him, but from the way you looked at him. As though he mattered, as though he belonged somewhere. He told us you didn't ask who he was or what he wanted. You just gave." Margaret's hands instinctively found each other, rubbing nervously at the flour still caught in her fingernails. "It didn't feel like much," she said quietly. "He looked like he needed help. I just couldn't ignore him. And that," Nora said, her voice nearly trembling, "is exactly why it meant so much." Around them, the town square had become a swirl of movement and gentle conversation. Townsfolk were mingling with the women from the woods, offering food, water, even places to rest. A group of teenagers had pulled together benches from the churchyard. Someone began pouring tea. A few of the children had even started playing a quiet game of tag in the far corner of the square, their laughter carrying lightly on the wind like a song. Half-Dash remembered. It was the kind of scene no one could have predicted, and no one would soon forget. Nora looked back at Margaret, eyes full of something unspoken. "We've spent years hiding," she said, "and perhaps we'll return to our lives beyond the forest soon enough. But today, we needed to come here, not to ask for anything, just to say thank you. Because for a moment, through the kindness of one woman, the walls between us vanished." Margaret felt a warmth bloom in her chest, not from pride, but from something deeper. She hadn't changed the world. But maybe, just maybe, she had helped someone believe it could be better. And that, she realized, was enough. The quiet conversation between Margaret and Nora was beginning to ripple outward, like a stone dropped gently into still water. The surrounding women from the forest community stood at ease now, their shoulders more relaxed, their posture softening, as they saw the town open itself in response, not with suspicion or ridicule, but with a kind of cautious welcome. Elmsfield had always been a place of routines and silent boundaries, but something had shifted. People were seeing each other, truly seeing, in a way they hadn't for years, perhaps ever. Nora glanced behind her, toward a cluster of women standing together near a cart draped with blankets and small parcels. "We debated whether we should come," she admitted, her voice now low and personal. "Many feared rejection, or worse. We've lived in hiding for so long that it felt almost unnatural to step into the open again. But Elijah," she paused, her expression tender. "He insisted." Margaret tilted her head. "He insisted." Nora nodded. "When he came back to us last night, he had barely caught his breath. His cheeks were red from the cold, his fingers stiff, but he wouldn't rest. Not until we had all gathered around To hear his story, he stood in the middle of our clearing, still clutching the bread, and told us what had happened, how a woman in the town gave it to him without hesitation. He didn't know your name, just said, "The warm lady in the flower dress." Margaret couldn't help but laugh softly, wiping at the corners of her eyes. "I suppose I do look like a bag of flour by mid-morning." "It's not what you looked like," Nora said, her smile touching her eyes. "It's how you made him feel. He said you didn't look through him like others do. You looked at him as if he were no different from any other child." He said that was the first time in his life he didn't feel invisible. Those words sank deep into Margaret's chest. She thought back to that moment, the small figure outside her window, the way he had stood so still, as if afraid the bread might vanish if he blinked. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than an ordinary act of kindness. But perhaps, it was exactly that ordinariness that made it so powerful. No grand speech, no dramatic rescue, just a piece of bread, and the dignity of being acknowledged. And that's when we knew, Nora continued, that we had to come here. Not just to thank you, but to remind our children and, maybe ourselves, that the world beyond our trees isn't entirely lost, that there is still goodness in it, that they don't have to grow up believing kindness is only a dream, we whispered to them at night. Margaret glanced around the square, where townspeople were still mingling with the visitors. A group of women from the forest were now seated on crates and benches, sipping tea brought from the cafe. A young man was helping repair the buckle on an older woman's saddle. Children from both groups had organized themselves into a chaotic game involving sticks and chalk lines, and for once, there was no distinction between us and them, just children playing. "It's strange, isn't it?" Margaret murmured. "How quickly we can forget that we belong to each other." Nora smiled faintly. "It's easy to forget when survival teaches you to build walls. We built ours out of necessity, you built yours out of tradition. But either way, they kept us apart, and all it took was a boy with an empty belly," Margaret said, voice thick with emotion. Nora's eyes softened, and a woman who answered with full hands and an open heart. There was a long pause as the two women stood side by side, watching the town and the forest people begin to mingle more freely. For Margaret, it felt like watching two rivers converge different waters, meeting not with violence, but with a quiet, powerful joining. She reached down, almost unconsciously, and adjusted the handle on the basket of wildflowers the young girl had given her earlier. It still sat by her feet, delicate blooms peeking out like whispers of the woods. "I don't know what will come next," Margaret admitted, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "But I truly hope this isn't the end of it." "It isn't," Nora said simply. "It's the beginning." Margaret didn't know exactly when the gathering in the square transformed from a moment of quiet reverence into something much more. Perhaps it was when the cafe owner rolled out a table and began setting down extra cups of tea and trays of fresh biscuits. Or maybe it was when the mayor's wife, long considered one of the town's more particular women, emerged from her home carrying a basket of knitted scarves and began handing them out to children, town and forest alike, with a firm but gentle smile. Whatever the turning point was, it happened organically, without fanfare or announcement. It was as if the town, stirred from its decades-long slumber, had finally remembered what it meant to open its arms without asking for explanations. Margaret, still in her flower-dusted apron and weathered shoes, found herself at the center of it, although not because anyone pointed at her or offered speeches in her name. No, it was quieter than that. People simply kept coming to her, offering smiles, asking if she needed help, or just placing small tokens of thanks near the bakery steps. A handmade candle, a jar of forest honey, a handful of wild chestnuts strung on twine. She accepted them all with humility, unsure what to say, unsure how to carry the weight of so much sudden appreciation. A group of women from the woods began helping inside the bakery without even asking. One stirred the rising dough, while another mended a torn curtain near the back door. An older woman, whose name Margaret never learned, silently scrubbed the soot from the stove's edges until it gleamed. There was no pride, no competition, only a quiet, shared understanding that work was a language of love, and this was their way of speaking it. By late afternoon, the town square looked more like a celebration than a chance encounter. Someone had brought out a fiddle, and its music wound through the air like thread, stitching people together in laughter and rhythm. Children danced without instruction, spinning in circles with wild hair and loud giggles. A pair of elderly men sat on a bench comparing tools with two forest women who clearly knew more about handcrafting than either of them. For the first time in living memory, no one asked where someone was from. They only asked if they wanted to sit, or eat, or share a story. Margaret stood on the bakery porch, watching it all unfold with a heart full to the brim. Beside her stood Elijah, the boy who had returned, this time with cleaner cheeks and eyes that looked less like they carried the whole world. He clutched another piece of bread, freshly baked and still warm, but this time, he wasn't running. He stood tall, nestled against her side, his small fingers curling slightly around the edge of her apron. "You came back," Margaret said softly. The boy nodded, looking up at her. "They said it was okay now." "It is," she whispered. gently smoothed the hair from his brow, then looked out over the crowd. She recognized faces from every corner of town, each of them softened in some new way. And she saw, too, the women from the woods no longer shadows or rumors, but neighbors, equals, mothers, sisters, teachers. Their differences, once stark and mysterious, now felt like threads in the same fabric. She noticed one young mother sitting on the steps of the town hall, bouncing her baby while laughing with a woman from Elmsfield's sewing circle. Beside them, a teenage girl was teaching a younger child how to braid rope. These were the kinds of scenes that didn't make headlines, that wouldn't be written into history books. But they were the ones that truly mattered. In a quiet voice, Margaret murmured to herself, "So this is what healing looks like." Nora, who had been speaking with a group nearby, turned and caught the words. She stepped back beside Margaret, her face glowing with the faint sheen of peace. "It's slow," she said, "but it starts with moments like this. Small moments. Shared. Bread. Open doors." Margaret nodded. "I didn't do much. I just gave him something to eat." "You gave him more than food," Nora replied. "You gave him proof that the world could be kind. And now look what that's done." The boy beside them leaned against Margaret a little more. She rested her hand gently on his back, her thoughts steady and full. The bread had been simple, but what had come of it was anything but. A seed had been planted, and now before her very eyes it was blooming. In the days that followed, Elmsfield felt different. The town still woke early, and the bakery still filled with the scent of rising dough each morning. The mayor still wore his too tight suspenders, and the postman still whistled off-key on his rounds. But beneath the surface of ordinary routines, something fundamental had changed. There was a softness in the air, a shared look between strangers, a new attentiveness in the way people greeted one another. It was as if the heart of the town, long beating quietly, safely, predictably, had been stirred awake and reminded that it was capable of beating for others, too. Margaret's life didn't return to normal because something better took its place. The women from the forest, once thought to be little more than stories, began visiting regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups. They brought wild herbs, honey, and hand-stitched crafts to trade. In return, the townspeople shared goods from the general store, access to the schoolhouse library, and simple things like news of the world beyond the woods. What had started as a silent boundary between two separate lives was now a woven path, lined with gestures of goodwill. And at the center of that bridge stood Margaret Bennett the baker, who had fed a hungry child without hesitation, and in doing so, had broken open something much bigger than she ever intended. People began to say the word Elmsfield with more warmth when they passed through the region. A traveling writer, who happened to be in town that fateful day, sent word of the story to a small publication, and within weeks, letters began arriving from strangers across the country. Some sent money for the children in the forest. Others sent notes of admiration for the women who had endured so much, and many simply wrote to say, "Thank you for reminding us what kindness looks like." But Margaret never saw herself as a hero. She never changed her routine. She still rose at 4 in the morning, still hummed her grandmother's lullabies as she baked, still greeted each customer with a gentle smile and a soft-spoken word. She didn't boast about what had happened. She didn't need to. Those who came to her for bread left with something more than just food. They left with the quiet knowledge that goodness didn't need a spotlight to matter. Elijah visited often. Not every day. He was still a curious boy, and the woods still called to him, but when he came, it was with a smile instead of a flinch. He had begun learning to read with help from the town's schoolteacher, and every so often, he would sit on a stool in the corner of the bakery, his legs swinging, reading aloud softly from a borrowed book, while Margaret worked. Sometimes, he'd help with the flour, or shape the dough, proud of every uneven loaf he made. And when others asked about him, curious townsfolk or newcomers who had only heard the story secondhand, Margaret would simply say, "That's Elijah. He's part of our family now." One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after that first unexpected visit, Margaret stood outside the bakery, a mug of tea warming her hands. The trees along the edge of town had turned shades of copper and fire, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke and harvest apples. A small group of children ran past, 2 of them from the town, the other 2 from the woods. No one noticed the difference anymore. No one cared. Nora stepped up beside her, wrapped in her familiar shawl. Hard to believe it all started with a single slice of bread. Margaret smiled, eyes following the children. Sometimes it only takes a little warmth to melt a wall. Nora nodded, and a lot of courage to offer that warmth first. They stood together in silence for a long moment, watching the town breathe in its new rhythm, a rhythm built not on fear or habit, but on something far more enduring, compassion. As the sun dipped low and the first stars began to show, Margaret turned back to her bakery, where the scent of honey, oat, and cinnamon still hung in the air. She opened the door, pausing just long enough to glance at the horizon. One boy, one loaf of bread, one choice to act with kindness, and from that, a whole new chapter had begun, not just for a town or a hidden community in the woods, but for anyone willing to believe that the smallest actions can lead to the most extraordinary change.